All right, good afternoon once again, grade 8 Adelpha. For today's video conference, we're going to talk about the basic concept on respect for human sexuality. So with you is your teacher Jomar in Values Education 2, and now we have our lesson objectives uh, for this topic. We only have two lesson objectives for this one. First is understand and explain human sexuality and its purpose. Second is reason out why respect for human sexuality is a core value. Okay, speaking of sexuality, it is more on about sex. And for us to know more about sex, it can be a verb or it can be a noun or something. So let's us know more about sex, okay, with the use of this video. So let me change to another microphone so that you can hear the audio from the PowerPoint presentation.
Let's talk about sex. It's totally okay if that makes you want to cringe. After all, most people will tell you that sex is private, not something that people generally talk about, at least not in class. Besides, sex is usually thought of as a deep primeval part of ourselves. It's a matter of drives and instincts, of biology and psychology. And if sex and sexuality are both primeval and private, can a social science tell us anything about them? Of course it can, because no matter how natural and private you think they are, sex and sexuality are still a part of every society. And like I've been saying since this course started, society gets in everywhere. In order to talk about sex, we need to get a handle on some terms, starting with sex. Not sex the act, but sex the category. Sex is a biological category, and it distinguishes between females and males. And biologically speaking, the root cause of sex is a pair of chromosomes, XX for females and XY for males. These chromosomes result in two kinds of visible differences. There are primary sex characteristics, which show up as the sex organs involved with the reproductive processes and which develop in utero. And then there are secondary sex characteristics, which develop at puberty and are not directly involved in reproduction. Things like pubic hair, enlarged breasts, or facial hair. Now, we tend to think of sex as a simple, fixed binary. You're either male or female. But that's not the case. A significant portion of the population is intersex. That is, people who are born with sex characteristics that do not fit typical binary notions of male or female bodies. This can mean a lot of different things. Like, it can mean having different combinations of sex chromosomes, as in Klinefelter syndrome, which creates chromosomes XX and Y, or in XXX syndrome, which results in XXX. An intersex condition can also mean that the body responds differently to hormones, or that the genitals aren't fully developed. This wide variety of intersex conditions makes population figures hard to pin down. If intersex is defined strictly in terms of having atypical genitalia at birth, then 1 in every 1,500 to 2,000 births fits that description. If defined more broadly, however, to include all of the conditions I just mentioned, intersex conditions appear in as much as 2% of the population. And of course, different societies respond to intersex people differently. In some societies, they're accepted as just a natural variation, but Western society and medicine have long understood sex as an immutable binary. So intersex people were not seen as an acceptable variation, but rather as a deviation in need of correction. Some intersex conditions do require medical intervention for the sake of the patient's health, but many don't. And for years, doctors performed unnecessary operations on intersex children in order to make them acceptable according to cultural ideas about sex. So society plays a role in the biological category of sex, but when it comes to gender, those distinctions are all about society. Gender is the set of social and psychological characteristics that a society considers proper for its males and females. The sets of characteristics assigned to men are masculinities, and those assigned to women are femininities. A lot of people have a hard time understanding the difference between sex and gender, but hopefully this definition makes it clear. Gender is its own thing, separate from sex. Some people don't even want to accept that gender is anything but biological, but sociology is here to tell you that it really isn't. Instead, it's a matter of social construction. To explore this idea some more, let's go to the thought bubble. Let's start with how we dress. A business suit is considered masculine, a skirt is feminine. And it should be obvious and uncontroversial that this is a purely social convention. Because, for example, you'd be pretty hard-pressed to explain the objective difference between a skirt and a kilt, except to say that wearing one is feminine and wearing the other is masculine. And this is also true of things that might seem to be more biologically determined. For example, physical labor like construction has typically been understood as masculine, and there might seem to be an underlying biological explanation for that, because on average, men do tend to be bigger and have more muscle mass than women. But even with an average difference between the sexes, there's a great deal of overlap too. Plenty of women are bigger and stronger than plenty of men, and minor differences in average size and strength can't explain why some occupations have been stratified by gender. The reality is that minor, average biological differences are used as the justification for widespread gender stratification, funneling males and females into different jobs, hobbies, and identity constructions. And society then points to this resulting stratification as proof of an underlying difference in biological reality, even though that reality doesn't actually exist. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So one way of thinking about gender is that it's a matter of a self-presentation, a performance that must be worked at constantly. What we wear, how we walk and talk, even our personal characteristics like aggression or empathy are all ways of doing gender. They're ways of making claims to masculinity or femininity that people will see and hopefully respect. And we can be sanctioned if we don't do gender right or well enough. This is precisely what's happening when a man is called a sissy or a woman is told that she really ought to smile more. The idea of gender as a performance is known as gender expression, but gender is more than that. It's also a matter of identity. Gender identity refers to a person's internal, deeply held sense of their gender. Nobody really perfectly fits the cultural ideal of masculinity or femininity, and lots of people construct their gender differently from these conventional ideas. In particular, transgender people are those whose gender identity doesn't match the biological sex they were assigned at birth. By contrast, cisgender people's gender identity matches their biological sex. Still, both trans and cis people can express their identity in a variety of ways, conventional or otherwise. And this should make it clear that gender, like sex, is not binary. There are many ways of doing femininities and many ways in which a person can be masculine. Now that we've got a basic understanding of sex and gender, we can finally get to sexuality. Sexuality is basically a shorthand for everything related to sexual behavior. Sexual acts, desire, arousal, the entire experience that is deemed sexual. One part of sexuality is sexual orientation, or who you're sexually attracted to or not. Most people identify as heterosexual, meaning that they're attracted to people of the other gender. While this is the most common orientation, significant numbers of people are homosexual, attracted to people of their own gender. But these are really only poles on a continuum, with plenty of people being attracted to both their own and other genders, as in bisexual or pansexual. And some people are asexual and don't experience sexual attraction at all. Now, these definitions can vary from person to person, just as they vary from society to society. This, and the fact that social norms may make people wish to keep their orientation private, makes estimates of the number of homosexual and bisexual people necessarily imprecise. That said, based on the surveys we do have, around 4% of the American population identifies as gay, lesbian, or bisexual. However, this increases to around 10% if we ask instead whether a person has ever experienced same-sex attraction or engaged in homosexual activity. So what can each of the three sociological paradigms tell us about sexuality? We'll start with symbolic interactionism because its insight is the most fundamental. And that is that sexuality, this intensely private and supposedly primeval thing, is socially constructed. You might think that this is a claim too far, because sexuality is a matter of inbuilt urges. Some things just are sexual. But if we actually start asking what is sexual, then the constructed nature of sexuality gets pretty obvious pretty fast. We might think, for instance, that oral sex is just sexual, but that's not necessarily true in all societies. For example, among the Sambia of the Eastern Highlands of Papua New Guinea, young boys perform oral sex on and ingest the semen of older men as part of a rite of passage to adulthood. Oral sex is definitely happening, but it's not clear that this should be thought of as sexual in the way we understand it. And we might also be inclined to label this ritual as homosexual behavior, but it's still not quite the same thing as homosexuality as we understand it in the US. So physically identical acts can have radically different social and subjective meanings. We can explain this in part with the concept of sexual scripts. These are cultural prescriptions that dictate the when, where, how, and with whom of sex, and what that that sex means when it happens. The idea that sex happens at home between two willing partners, for example, is part of a generic sexual script in our society. Likewise, sex that happens between two people who met at a bar might come with a different script and therefore different shared expectations than sex between two people who've known each other for a long time. This brings us to the structural functionalist perspective. Since sexual reproduction is necessary for the reproduction of society, this view says that sex has to be organized in some way in order for society to function. And society organizes sexuality by using sexual scripts. Before contraception was widespread, it was these norms that controlled how many people were born by determining when and how often people had sex. And by controlling who had sex with whom, they also generally made sure that those kids were born into families that could support them. This is one function of the universal incest taboo, the prohibition of sex between close relatives. Reproduction between family members would ultimately break down kinship relations. It would be impossible to maintain a clear set of familial obligations if, for instance, your brother could also be your father. But as seen from the perspective of social conflict theory, regulating sexuality is also a matter of creating and reinforcing inequalities. In particular, our society is traditionally built around heteronormativity. This is the idea that there are only two genders, that gender corresponds to biological sex, and that the only natural and acceptable sexual attraction is between these two genders. Heteronormativity makes heterosexuality seem like it's directly linked to biological sex, but heterosexuality is just as much a social construction as any other sexuality. It's defined by dominant sexual scripts, privileged by law, and normalized by social practices like religious teachings. So it comes to be understood as natural in a way that other sexualities are not. Queer theory challenges this naturalness and especially shows how gender and heterosexuality are tied together. Heteronormativity is based on the idea of two opposite sexes that naturally fit together like poles of a magnet. So by this logic, men pursue, women are pursued. Men are dominant, women are submissive. But all this is socially constructed. The sexes aren't opposites, there are just two of them at both ends of a spectrum, along with a whole array of variations between them. But the idea of opposite sexes helps make heterosexuality seem natural to us. And so you can see how sex, gender, and sexuality are all linked and all socially constructed. And you can see how society gets in everywhere, even among these apparently private and primeval things. And in turn, these things help structure society, creating and sustaining inequalities and giving them the veneer of the natural. But sociology can help us pick them apart. Today we learned about what sociology can tell us about sex and sexuality. We talked about the biological classification of sex and how it's more complicated than we tend to think. And
a little bit about how it works. Finally, we talked about sexuality and sexual orientation, what the three paradigms of sociology tell us about them. Crash course sociology is still, let's talk about sex. It's totally okay.
Guys, kinig na ako. Nag-switch na ako ng sound. Okay, thank you, Vince. So, so much information for for sexuality. So after this video, we're going to add the word respect for us to discuss our discussion. Knowing the basic information about sexuality, let's reflect about this one. So I have here an image. So let us take a look at the picture. So instead of fighting for more women's bodies to be viewed as valuable, let's fight for women to be valued as more than bodies to view. As well, this goes ganun din sa mga lalaki. Okay? So hindi lang, when we talk about respect for human sexuality, it is not about sex or the verb sex or about the private parts that we have. Okay, it's more on respecting or valuing what we have in our body. Okay, so what I have here is, what do you think of this picture? Anyone? Hey lady, you'll be prettier if you smile. Come on. Okay, what do you think about this picture? Do you think it is kind of friendly or offensive? What do you think? Any idea, thoughts about this picture? Black-handed compliment po. Yes, backhanded compliment. Nakakairita po. Ano pa? Okay, tama naman. Nakakairita. Parang mayroon siyang gustong makuha or meron siyang gustong ipagawa sa babae na hindi naman dapat na gawin. Ano pa kaya? Misogynistic, rude. Well, actually, there's another picture, there's another story next to this picture, and this is what In this the picture. Yan. So, ito yung continuation ng story ng dalawang characters dun sa picture. So, hey, I'm just giving you a compliment. Don't be so offended. You know, as a female, you're only here to improve our my visual field. When you don't smile, it decreases my ano to yun? Hindi ko mabasa masyado. Yeah. Well, anyway, looking at these two pictures and reflecting and internalizing about the message in this um, pictures, yan, medyo ito talaga ay mali because this will relate us to what we call objectification. What do you mean by objectification? So it is degrading the status of a mere object or the act of treating a person or sometimes an animal as an object or a thing. Kumbaga, it is more on their own selfish desire or pleasure. Kumbaga, mapasaya lang yung sarili niya, wala siyang pakailam sa tao or sa anumang bagay basta na nagpapasaya sa kanya yung isang bagay na yon. So what I have here is a picture, is another picture about objectification. So have you heard of objectifo objectifophilia? Philia. It's when you're attracted to objects. Oh, I have that. Really? Yeah, I'm attracted to women. So in this example, na binuview niya or nakikita niya yung woman as an object or as a tool, hindi as a human person. So nawawala dito yung word na respect. At kinakailangan nating i-practice sa sarili natin in our everyday life for us to respect each and every one of us regardless of sex or gender. Okay? Hindi dapat natin nakita ang isang tao as a tool o pampalipas oras lamang or an object itself. Yan. So in this lesson, let's try to reflect and answer these three questions. Why do we have to respect human sexuality? Why is a core value that we have to hold on? Why is this a core value that we have to hold on? And next one is, what are the implications of a mistaken sense of sexuality to culture and society? So let us think and reflect about this in these three questions in this video conference as we go through the discussion. Medyo mahaba pa lang. Yan. Upon checking the modules the modules provided by the Philippines, the PSI system, medyo controversial siya. Kung nabasa nyo kung talagang naunawaan nyo yung nasa module, merong maling context na hindi ko maintindihan kung bakit ganun yung nakalagay doon. So maybe napansin nyo rin yon, and let's try to find out what is true about or what is wrong about this context in the module. Yan. Before that, let's begin by pointing out the most essential and foundational ideas tested by time, logic, and reason. So first, human sexuality begins with the truth of the nature of the human person as revealed in the design of the body. Sexuality implies bodiliness. So it pertains to our genitals or our private parts. So the meaning of human sexuality is associated with the human body. It is interesting to note that our anatomy exposes that the male and the female body cannot be understood without its counterpart. Yes, this is very true because as a human person, we cannot understand each other without the counterpart of our sex, di ba? Para di ba nga sa science, para nagkakaintindihan tayo kung merong ibang tao na tumitingin sa atin as another person. So in that way, as male or female, naintindihan natin yung pagkakaiba ng bawat tao. Kasi nakikita natin, ay ganito pala si ganyan, ay ganito pala to. And as well as other individuals or other, kumbaga hindi lang sa male and female, kundi din sa ibang mga gender. Okay? And then based on the form and functions of the male and female sexual organs, it can be said that primary purpose of human sexuality is a kind of unity between the persons involved and procreation. ito yung nakikita natin kanina. This is something to do with procreation or reproduce para hindi ma-extinct ang human race. Yan, the unity between the person involved in procreation. But hindi ito yung tinutukoy natin na end goal ng isang tao. When we say end goal, in Latin, it is telos. Kumbaga, when we talk about telos, the end goal, napag-usapan natin to from our previous discussion, it is about finding our purpose in life, finding our happiness in life according to Aristotle. But when we talk about reproduction, it is not our end goal. Ito yung nakikita kong mali dun sa context, dun sa module. Sana aware kayo dun, no? So, tinatama ko yung ano yung mali dun sa context. Medyo confusing kasi yung nakalagay dun. Yan. There are different states of life for men and women. Okay? So, obviously, we have the single. Second is conjugal union of the married. The third one is consecrated celibacy. For the single, so yun yung mga walang jowa. Okay? Basically, sila yung hindi pa kinakasal. Okay? Sila yun, yung mga single na yun. Sir, paano po yung may mga boyfriend, may girlfriend? Considered ka pa rin as single kasi hindi ka pa kinakasal. Okay? So, next one is conjugal union of the married. Also, ito yung mga kinasal na under the matrimony of, may mga rights sa Catholic Church, sa ibang mga religion, kinasal sa simbahan, and sakop din dito yung mga kinasal sa yung mga tinatawag civil wedding. Yan, basta merong kontrata or papel na pinanghahawakan na yung dalawang taong yun ay nagsasama. Okay, that is the conjugal union of the married. Okay, sa third one is consecrated celibacy. Sir, sino-sino po yung mga taong to? So these are the priests, yung mga nuns. Sila yung mga yan. Kasi in priesthood, ikinakasal ka sa Diyos. O kung sa Catholic Church, so yung mga pare, ikinasal sila hindi kay Mary, kundi ikinasal sila or nagpatali sila mismo, nag-commit sila ng relationship to God. Yun yung kanilang dedicate themselves to a religious spiritual cause. Yun yung tinatawag natin consecrated celibacy. But another question here is, sir, nasan po dito yung mga live-in, yung mga nagli-live-in, yung nagsasama nang hindi naman kasal. Just like I said earlier, kung hindi kasal, kasama siya sa single. Pero sir, parang hindi pa rin siya ma-distinguish kasi nagsasama sila. They have their own family. Pero hindi pa rin sila kasal. Saan sila puposisyon sa state of life for men and women? Okay? Saan sila lugar dyan? Well, actually, they are in between single and conjugal union of the married. Hindi lang exact yung term, pero nandun sila sa gitna. Okay? Malalaman, sir, mabuti ba or maganda pa na okay lang ba na mag-live-in kahit hindi kasal? O mas maganda, sir, na kasal ang isang tao bago sila magsama sa isang bubong? What do you think, Adelva? Sir, paano po kung engage lang? Okay, thank you, Jet, for this question. Kapag engage lang, still nandun pa rin sila in between single and conjugal union of married. Kasi wala pa silang contract or paper or legal documents na pinanghahawakan na sila ay pinag-isa in the sense of meron kumbaga may wedding marriage contract, yung mga ganon, yung mga panghinahawakan na pwede kang yung bagat itinatali or nag-commit ka na dun sa isang tao at hindi mo na siya pwedeng palitan. Okay? Kapag engaged lang, it falls falls between single and conjugal union of the married. Ito yung tinatawag natin yung sa kumbaga live-in. Pero kapag kinasal na sila, madidistinguish na sila as conjugal union of the married. Okay? So going back to the question, sir, kung kayo ang papipiliin, anong mas gusto nyo in your state of life? Yung live-in or yung married life? Sa inyo, what do you think, guys? though wala pa naman kayo sa stage na yon, pero what if there's an instance na dumating sa point ng buhay niyo na meron kayo ng kapartner, regardless of gender, kung lalaki sa lalaki ba yan, babae sa babae, or lalaki sa babae, or ano man. Pati, okay lang ba sa inyo na live-in partner, or do you want to be married? Or kung gusto nyo mag-ano lang kayo, dun kayo sa consecrated na celibacy, magpare kayo or magmadre. Kay PB, okay lang po pareho. Well, actually, there's disadvantages and disadvantages about marriage and being in a live-in relationship. Kapag live-in relationship kasi, wala kayong pinangahawakan. Though mahal na mahal niyo ang isa't isa, pero kapag nagkasilipan ng mga ari-arian, yung mga kayamanan ng mga tagto assets and liabilities, yan, kayo na mapupunta yon. Kasi doon yun ano eh, doon yun yung tinitingnan kung kayo na mapupunta yon, just in case. And also kumbaga yung kapag live-in, wala kang assurance na hindi kayo iwan ng isang tao. Yun yung mahirap doon. That is the disadvantage. Kapag married naman, yes, meron kang rights dun sa taong yun. Pero what if you fall sa isang taong mali, kumbaga, sa una lang sweet, sa una lang ikaw mahal, pero as you go through the marriage life, bigla siyang nagbago, tapos tinasaktan ka niya. So, hindi ka na makakalis. That is also the disadvantage of being married. So, in our life, we have to think carefully. Ayan, wait lang. Para saan po live-in po kung matagal na sila na together? Single? Sir, yung akin po. Yes, Venice. Anong, ano ang iyong point of view, Venice? Hindi ko nabasa. Saan na ba? Ito, married po siguro, kaso siguro po before that live-in po. Ayan, there's nothing wrong naman. I'm not saying na mali yung live-in, ano. Hindi ko na sinasabi na mali rin yung magpakasal. Well, actually, I am a married man. Yan, a happy married man. And my advice to you, grade 8 Adelpha, is to think carefully before you go into a relationship. Kasi once you go through this thing called relationship, magiging complicated ang lahat. There's always a big responsibility when you come into a relationship. You have to give yourself or to limit yourself. Kumbaga, wag mong ibibigay din lahat kasi kailangan mong magtira sa sarili mo. You have to secure also yourself. Huwag ka masyadong pakasiguro hanggang sa makilala mo mabuti yung tao na makakasama mo habang buhay. Okay? Take note of that. Kasi meron namang mga live-in partner na talagang successful sila sa buhay nila. At meron din namang mga married couple na talagang masaya sila sa buhay nila. Di ba? So again, my advice is to think carefully before you go into a relationship, and you must know the person that you're with. Ayan, ba't ang pasama dito si Mercury? Yan. Hindi pala yan. Yeah, the following are offenses against dignity of marriage. Yan, adultery, divorce, live-in, or trial marriage. Alam naman natin na yan. Adultery, yung pangabet. Divorce, ito rin yung isang issue sa Pilipinas. Actually, divorce are accepted in some countries. Pero sa atin medyo parang annulment lang yata yung binapayagan. So, kapag divorce ka talagang totally i-break mo yung contract. I agree in this divorce because there are merong produkto ng fixed marriage or yung mga na pinakasal lang dahil nabuntis, 'di ba? So, nagpakasal lang, kumbaga, napakasal sa isang tao na hindi maganda ang pag-uugali, na sasaktan lang sila. So, sinasabi ko nga, 'di ba, kapag hindi ka na masaya sa buhay na kinalalagyan mo, you have to go out in that zone because you deserve to be happy and not to be sad through your life. Yan, then live in and trial, then yun yan. Again, malapit na pala tayo matapos. So, about sexuality, when biblically speaking, it is more on chastity, the purity of the purity of the heart. When we talk about the purity of the heart, it is making your body sacred. Kumaga, hinihahanda mo yung sarili mo sa taong mamahalin mo at ibibigay mo habang buhay. Ibibigay mo yung buhay mo sa kanya habang buhay. Sa hirap at ginhawa, sa sickness and poor, yan, sa ano yan, yung promises na ginagawa sa kasal. Well, there are offenses against the virtue of chastity. Let me share to you the context in the module. 'Di ba? Basahin niyo lang kung sa tingin ko nabasa niyo na 'to eh kasi I think nag-trend to sa isang social media. Nag-trend to sa social media. Are you aware of this context in the module? Homosexual act. So, extend lang tayo ng mga at least 4 minutes to discuss this one. Medyo alam na naman natin yung ibang mga nakalagay dito sa offenses against the virtue of chastity. But I want to point out this one, guys. Well, homosexual act, because homosexuals are persons, they have to be respected owing to their dignity. And this is correct. Regardless of gender, sex, or ano mga social status in life, we should respect each other. And yan, this is correct. So, biblically speaking, homosexual act, however, cannot be considered moral. Yes, in biblical speaking, this is considered as immoral act kapag tinutukoy na kapag biblically speaking, as they transgress the design of the human body and impede the attainment of telos of the person. So, this context implies na ang end goal ng isang tao daw ay kumbaga reproduction. Kasi kapag 'di ba homosexual, same gender yung gusto mo. So kapag lalaki sa lalaki, so walang mabubuong baby or hindi magkakameron ng another human being, as well as kapag babae sa babae. So ito yung tinutukoy dito. Pero ang mali kasi dito sa context na to is the attainment of the telos of the person, which is not the end goal of man. The end goal of man or the telos of man is not reproduction. It is about finding our purpose in life, finding our true happiness in life. That is our telos, hindi yung about reproduction. Okay? Clear tayo dyan ha. So, nakita nyo ba ito sa Twitter? Alam ko nakita ko sa Twitter eh. Medyo trending to. Yan. So, kina-clarify ko lang guys para maitama natin. Well, guys, if you see something, if you are confused about the context written in our modules, huwag nyo siyang ipopost sa social media. Kasi meron tayong, as a Pisay scholar, meron tayong sinusunod na rules na hindi dapat magko-correct ng ganon when it comes to context. Kinakailangan idaan nyo siya sa process or idaan nyo sa sa tamang tao or i-address nyo sa tamang tao para magawa ng action. Okay? Ayan. We should be responsible enough to post something in social media, lalo na't napaka-powerful ng social media when it comes to spreading information. Yan. So anyway, I hope na intindihan yung discussion natin, though medyo nagmamadali tayo kasi hindi talaga to kayang i-discuss ng 30 minutes. Maraming issue na kinakailangang talakayan about respect for human sexuality. And I hope nakatulong yung explanation ko to understand something about respect for human sexuality. Well, thank you so much for your time, grade 8 Adalpa, and I hope to see you soon face to face. This is your teacher Jomar saying keep safe, God bless, and goodbye, grade 8 Adalpa.
Goodbye. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Benice. I well appreciated. Thank you din sa inyo, Mika, Lea, PB, Talia, and everyone else.